The night was perfectly still. No wind, no footsteps, no war drums in the distance. Just the sound of a river, gentle, constant, almost comforting. And then, before the first guard could shout a warning, they were gone. Not taken by enemies, not struck by lightning, erased by the one thing they trusted most, the water. Here is what history forgot to tell you. The most battle-hardened warriors of the Great Plains, men who faced war, famine, and brutal winters without flinching, were deeply, strategically afraid of rivers. Not because they were weak, because they were wise. For generations, Lakota chiefs enforced a rule so counterintuitive it would shock any modern survival expert. Never camp near water. 7 reasons, 7 invisible dangers, 7 lessons that kept an entire civilization alive for centuries. By the end of this, you will never look at a riverbank the same way again. And you will understand why the Lakota said, "The river gives, but it always takes back." Long before an enemy raised a weapon, the river had already begun its attack. It started before dawn, a thick white silence rising from the water's surface. Not ordinary morning mist, river fog, heavier, wetter, colder than anything that formed on the hills above. Within minutes, it swallowed the riverbank whole. A sentry standing at his post could no longer see his own hands. Trees disappeared. The outlines of teepees vanished. The world shrank to a gray circle no wider than a few meters, and everything beyond it became invisible. This is what the Lakota understood that most people never consider. Fog doesn't just hide the enemy, it hides everything, including your ability to defend yourself. River valleys acted as natural fog traps. Cold air descended into the lowlands at night, met the warmer water surface, and condensed into a dense white veil that could linger until mid-afternoon, long after the sun had already burned it away on the hills above. The Lakota called this phenomenon something that roughly translates as the breath of the water spirits. Modern meteorologists call it radiation fog pooling in topographic depressions. Both are describing the same deadly truth. From a hilltop, however, the picture was entirely different. Guards could stand above the fog, watching the white sea below, and any movement within it sent visible ripples across the surface. A large group of approaching warriors could not hide from eyes positioned above. Rule 1. Never let the landscape blind you before the enemy does. But fog stole your vision. What came next stole something even more critical: your hearing. Experienced Lakota trackers could reportedly distinguish the sound of a dry branch snapping from remarkable distances across open prairie. In the silence of the plains, sound traveled far and clean. An approaching group of warriors might be heard long before they came into view. This was not a small advantage. At night, when eyes became almost useless, hearing was everything, and the river destroyed it completely. The constant rush of moving water, especially over shallow rapids, generates what acoustics researchers today call broadband noise. Sound spread evenly across frequencies, capable of masking virtually every other sound within a radius of several hundred meters. Footsteps, voices, the clink of a weapon against stone. Near a river, a night guard was effectively deaf, but there is a deeper cruelty to this. The Lakota knew the darkness was when enemies preferred to move. The darkness was when a camp was most vulnerable, and it was precisely in that darkness that the river's noise was most devastating. Not because it got louder, but because everything else went quieter. On high ground, the wind became an ally. It carried sounds from far away, bending across the flat prairie and delivering them to trained ears with remarkable clarity. Scouts positioned on elevated terrain could hear what lowland guards never could. A warrior who cannot hear is already half defeated before the first arrow flies. Rule 2. Your hearing is a weapon. Guard it as carefully as your bow. They protected their ears. But there was one weapon the river was already destroying in silence, without anyone noticing until it was too late. No enemy arrow broke it. No battle damaged it. The bow simply failed. The warrior reached for his weapon at the moment he needed it most, drew the string back, and felt it. Loose, heavy, wrong. The sinew that had been tight and responsive the evening before had absorbed moisture through the night. Not from rain, not from a river crossing, simply from the air. The thick, invisible humidity that settled into every lowland camp like an uninvited guest. This was one of the most insidious dangers of camping near water because it left no visible warning. The traditional Lakota bow was a masterpiece of natural engineering, a short, powerful weapon constructed from wood, bone, and sinew, often reinforced with hide glue along the back. Each material was chosen for its mechanical properties under dry conditions, but introduce sustained humidity, and the system begins to fail quietly. Sinew bowstrings are hygroscopic, meaning they absorb moisture from the surrounding air. Studies of similar traditional materials suggest that at relative humidity above 70%, common in river valley nights, sinew can lose significant elasticity and structural tension. The draw weight drops, the arrow flies short, slow, and unpredictable. The wooden frame absorbs moisture and warps. The hide glue softens. A weapon that took weeks to craft could be rendered unreliable by a single damp night. When the Lakota later acquired firearms, the problem worsened. Black powder is acutely sensitive to moisture. Even moderate humidity can cause misfires or complete failure to discharge. A wet gun in a firefight is not a weapon. It is dead weight. The solution was not complicated, but it required discipline. Camp high, where the wind keeps the air dry. Some warriors also wrapped their bows in treated animal fat, particularly bear grease, creating a moisture barrier that modern materials scientists would recognize as a surprisingly effective waterproofing method. The river did not need to flood your camp to defeat you. It could do it quietly, invisibly, one humid night at a time. Rule 3. Water destroys what no enemy could. Keep your weapons above the valley floor. But silent destruction was one thing. What the river could do when it chose to move, that was something else entirely. The sky above the camp was clear, stars visible, no thunder, no rain. The river beside them ran low and calm, barely whispering over the stones. And then, sometime before dawn, the wall arrived. Flash floods on the Great Plains are among the most violent and deceptive natural phenomena in North America. The trigger, a heavy thunderstorm, can occur 30, 40, even 50 miles away from the campsite. The water has nowhere to go but downstream, funneled by the flat terrain into channels and riverbeds, accelerating as it collects. NOAA data indicates that flash floods can raise water levels by 3 to 6 meters in under 30 minutes. The surge arrives with almost no local warning. No rain overhead, no darkening sky, no rising wind, just silence. And then a sound like the world tearing open. The Lakota had seen what this force could do. Centuries-old cottonwood trees, some with trunks wider than a man's arm span, ripped from the earth and carried downstream like kindling. Sandbars that looked solid enough to sleep on, gone in seconds. Everything on the floodplain, tippies, supplies, tools, people, taken by water that felt no urgency and asked no permission. But here is what distinguished the experienced scouts from the careless. They read the river's memory. High water marks left on tree trunks, debris caught in branches far above the current waterline, told the story of every major flood that river had ever produced. Before establishing any long-term camp, senior scouts examined these marks with great care. The camp would be positioned well above the highest recorded line, not approximately above, measurably, deliberately above. The prairie, in this way, was a library. Every tree a page. Every waterline a warning written by storms that had passed decades before. On a hill, none of this mattered. The water raged far below. The camp watched from safety, untouched. Rule 4. The river remembers every storm it has ever carried. The question is whether you do too. Flash floods could erase a camp in minutes, but the next danger required no storm, no surge, no dramatic event at all. It worked slowly, and that made it far more dangerous. It never announced itself. No flood, no fog, no sound at all. Just a slow, creeping heaviness that settled into the lungs and didn't leave. After spring floods receded across the Great Plains, the river left behind what it could not carry. Shallow, isolated pools scattered across the floodplain, cut off from the main current, warming rapidly under the prairie sun. Within days, these standing bodies of water became something fundamentally different from the river that created them. They became traps. Stagnant water in warm conditions creates ideal environments for waterborne pathogens, bacteria, protozoa, and organisms responsible for illnesses that 19th century plains communities would have recognized as debilitating fever, severe weakness, and prolonged dysentery. These were not minor discomforts. In a nomadic community where physical strength was the difference between mobility and vulnerability, a week of illness could compromise an entire group's ability to move, hunt, or defend itself. But the water itself was only part of the danger. The organic matter decomposing in these shallow pools, dead vegetation, animal waste, accumulated sediment, produced gases including methane and hydrogen sulfide. Modern environmental science confirms that prolonged exposure to hydrogen sulfide, even at relatively low concentrations, causes headaches, fatigue, and respiratory irritation. The Lakota described this as the lowlands stealing a warrior's strength. They were not wrong. The dense vegetation that grew along marshy riverbanks compounded the problem further. Movement became difficult. Firewood collection required exhausting effort through tangled undergrowth. The spatial constriction of the lowlands pressed against the natural rhythms of a community that depended on open space and clear sightlines. The Lakota solution was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to purify standing water, they sought moving water, or better, water that had never moved above ground at all. Hidden springs, bubbling cold and clear from beneath the rock, became among the most strategically valuable resources a tribe could possess. Knowledge of their locations was closely guarded, shared within the community, concealed from outsiders. Where springs were unavailable, scouts dug shallow pits beside fast-moving sections of river, allowing water to seep slowly through layers of sand and gravel before collection. Modern hydrologists recognize this technique as a primitive form of riverbank filtration, a process still used in water treatment systems across Europe and North America today. The river was not the enemy, but standing water, water that had stopped moving, stopped renewing itself, was something to be avoided with the same caution as an armed stranger. Rule 5. Run from water that has forgotten how to flow. It has already begun to decay. The Lakota avoided poison in still water. But there was a poison of a different kind waiting in the valleys. One that didn't attack the body, it attacked the entire structure of survival itself. Every military strategist in history has understood one principle instinctively: control the high ground. Sun Tzu wrote about it. Roman legions practiced it. Every major military doctrine from ancient Greece to the Second World War acknowledges that elevation is tactical advantage. It extends visibility, increases the effective range of projectile weapons, forces attackers to expend energy climbing while defenders remain rested, and provides escape routes in multiple directions. The Lakota did not read Sun Tzu, but they arrived at the same conclusions and built an entire civilization around them. A camp positioned on elevated ground could observe movement for miles in every direction. Scouts watching from a hilltop could detect the dust cloud raised by an approaching war party long before that party came within striking distance. That warning, measured in minutes, sometimes hours, was the difference between preparation and massacre. In a river valley, that warning disappeared entirely. Visibility ended at the nearest bend in the river. Dense riparian vegetation blocked sightlines at ground level. The terrain itself funneled movement toward the camp rather than allowing defenders to intercept it at distance. A valley camp could not see who was coming, could not hear them over the water, and had nowhere to retreat without crossing the river itself. The river at your back was not protection. It was a wall that worked against you. The Lakota teepee circle, often described primarily as a cultural or spiritual arrangement, was also a precision defensive system. Positioned on open, elevated ground, the circular layout created unobstructed 360-degree sightlines for perimeter guards. The largest dwellings of senior warriors occupied the inner ring. The outer ring, younger families, lighter sleepers, functioned as an early warning layer. No terrain feature could be allowed to compromise this geometry, which meant no valley, no riverbank, no lowland depression could serve as a permanent home. There is a psychological dimension worth noting here. An enemy approaching a large Lakota encampment on a hilltop, hundreds of painted teepees visible from miles away, guards clearly visible against the skyline, faced a calculation that went beyond military arithmetic. The display of deliberate, elevated confidence communicated something that no wooden wall could. We have chosen this ground. We know this ground. You are walking into our terms. Many conflicts, historical accounts suggest, ended before they began, not because the attackers lacked courage, but because they recognized a prepared position when they saw one. Rule 6. The valley gives you water. The hill gives you everything else. They had mastered fog, sound, weapons, floods, poison, and warfare. But every winter, the Great Plains offered one final test, one that the river made far more dangerous than it needed to be. Winter on the Great Plains is not a season, it is a test. Temperatures across the northern plains regularly drop below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. In recorded history, extreme cold events have pushed readings to -40 and beyond, a threshold where the distinction between Fahrenheit and Celsius collapses into a single, simple truth. Unprotected exposure kills within minutes. Under these conditions, choosing the wrong campsite was not a mistake you recovered from. Cold air behaves differently from warm air. It is denser, heavier, and it flows, not upward like heat, but downward, pooling in low-lying areas the way water pools in a depression after rain. Meteorologists call this phenomenon cold air drainage, or frost pocket formation. On a clear, calm winter night, valley floors and river bottoms can register temperatures 5 to 8 degrees Celsius colder than the surrounding elevated terrain, a difference that, at extreme baseline temperatures, is the difference between survivable and fatal. The Lakota understood this not through instruments but through generations of observation, and through the losses that came before that understanding was fully formed. River valleys in winter compounded every danger the warmer months had already established. The fog returned, now carrying ice crystals instead of moisture. The acoustic dampening of running water continued regardless of temperature, and the valley floor, already the coldest zone in the landscape, funneled and concentrated the heaviest air into exactly the space where a careless camp might be pitched. Snow compounded the trap. Blizzard winds, deflected by valley walls, created unpredictable eddies that deposited massive drifts in lowland areas. Documented cases from plains winters describe drifts reaching the rooflines of early settler structures built near riverbeds. A camp buried under such a drift faced not just cold, but immobility. And immobility, for a nomadic people, was its own form of death sentence. On the plateau above, the same blizzard wind that sounded terrifying did something useful. It scoured the snow away, leaving a hard, navigable crust. Movement remained possible. Escape routes stayed open. The cold was present, inescapable on the open plain, but it was the same cold everywhere, not the concentrated, amplified cold of the valley floor. The Lakota elders encoded this knowledge into the stories they told children on winter nights. Tales of valleys that swallowed travelers whole, of frost spirits that lived in the river's bed and pulled the warmth from sleeping bodies. Modern listeners might hear folklore, but inside those stories was precise meteorological instruction, the kind that kept children alive long enough to become elders who could pass it on. Rule 7. In winter, cold does not fall from the sky. It rises from the valley floor. Never sleep where cold collects. 7 dangers, 7 rules, 7 reasons why the people who knew this land best chose to keep their distance from its most abundant resource. Now, why does any of this still matter? There is a word in modern psychology, proximate bias, the tendency to trust what is closest, what is most immediately visible, what feels most obviously useful. Water is visible. Water is immediate. Water feels like safety. The Lakota knew better, not because they feared the river, but because they respected it completely. They understood it well enough to know exactly what it could take from them, and they chose, deliberately and wisely, to maintain their distance. That distance was not weakness. It was the highest form of strategic intelligence, knowing which gifts come with hidden costs, and choosing not to pay them. 7 invisible dangers, 7 rules forged not in classrooms or military academies, but in the unforgiving laboratory of the Great Plains, where every mistake had consequences, and the consequences did not negotiate. The river is still there. It still fogs at dawn, still drowns out sound at night, still rises without warning, still pools cold air in its bed through February. It has not changed. The only question the Lakota would ask of anyone standing on its bank today is the same question their scouts asked before every camp was established. Do you understand what you are standing next to, or do you only see the water? True survival has never been about finding resources. It has always been about understanding what those resources demand in return. The Lakota answered that question. For centuries, that answer kept them alive.